Just gonna record, but yeah. Oh, well. Okay, so we're live. This is Paradigmatic Discussions number 10, all about the brain, consciousness, psychology, all of that. And I have a great guest with me today to go through it. This is Bryce Cornell from the EA show. He has a bachelor's in psychology, so he's definitely a great guest. Hi, Bryce. How you doing?
Hi, how's it going? Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here. So yeah, as I said, we're going to be going through everything pertaining to the brain, the soul, all of that. So these are some kind of my source material, kind of some relevant books. I don't know if
hmm
you're familiar with any of them or not.
I have
Um,
not. Well, I mean, I've heard of a couple of them. The Sam Harris one,
right.
and also Soul Fallacy. I haven't read any of these though.
Yeah,
But
I didn't
I'm
know
probably
about
gonna, I'm probably gonna be taking notes because some of those look pretty. I recognize the authors of most of them, and yeah.
yeah. Yeah, the Carl Sagan one is really interesting because I didn't know about it, and I think it's his first book, all about speculating about the origins of human consciousness. So it won a
hmm
Pulitzer Prize even. So that's yeah. When I discovered that, it was pretty cool. Um,
Yeah, and I think that maybe just speaking on that one in particular, Carl Sagan, if I'm not mistaken, was a cosmologist, was he not?
yeah,
And
that wasn't necessarily his specialty. He did I don't think had a specific expertise in that, but he was kind of
right.
gathering data from the latest research on it.
hmm
So
I love Carl Sagan, but
me
I would
too. Yeah,
probably be more inclined to read his works relating to cosmology than the soul. But then there's some
yeah,
other people here who would probably, like Sam Harris, I would probably be interested in reading that one.
yeah. Sam Harris has some really motivational stuff to say about the mind and just
Mhm.
mindfulness and things of that nature. Definitely. So just some opening quotes. These two pertaining to where we came from, where we're going.
Mhm.
Um, and I just did like a really quote heavy podcast on iconic atheists. I just kind of gotten into the slide stuff. It's kind of useful. But if you want to read some of these, some of the opening ones, or I can, it's all good. But just to kind of give
Um,
the any viewers who might not be aware of any of this some good overall comments on things.
Right.
Um,
And so the first part talking about basically the evolution of life and the development of the brain and the flatworm being the first animal that we think developed something like a brain and its basic blueprint, its physical blueprint.
right,
Just looking at it, the I guess it wouldn't be remains, but uh, fossilized versions and living versions as well. A very minimal and or primitive, I guess would be the word, physical construction of what would come to be, what would come to evolve into brains that we see more similar to ours in mammals, uh,
right.
primates, hominids.
Wasn't it a flatworm that first had kind of like an eye socket or an eye dent that could a light sensitive like areas, something like that?
I'm not sure. I would imagine that for some reason in my mind, I want to say that it seems like it would have been a fish, but because I know or some type of oceanic life,
Yeah,
but I could be
oceanic,
wrong.
but I don't think it was a fish though. I think it was some kind of
Yeah, I
very
said fish.
small.
I mean, yeah, you're right. I
Yeah,
think it was probably something that came from the ocean, though.
right, right,
Usually, the first features that the first types of animal life that we see tend to
right.
spring from the oceans.
Now this second one I think is a really a beautiful kind of quote, kind of getting our overall like trajectory where we come from and what we as humans are capable of. It's from a
Mhm.
book called The Brain by David Eagleman. There was actually a series that was on PBS. So it says over the last 100,000 years, our species has been on quite a journey. We've gone from living as primitive hunter-gatherers, surviving on scraps, to a planet-conquering, hyper-connected species that defines its own destiny. Today, we enjoy mundane experiences that our ancestors could never have dreamed of. We have clean rivers that we can call into to our well-adorned caves when we desire. We hold small rock-sized devices that contain the knowledge of the world. We regularly see the tops of clouds and the curvature of our home planet from space. We send messages to the other side of the globe in 80 milliseconds and upload files to a floating space colony of humans at 60 megabits per second. Even when simply driving to work, we routinely move at speeds that outstrip biology's greatest masterpieces, such as cheetahs. Our species owes its runaway success to the special properties of the 3 pounds of matter stored inside our skulls. If we can understand the secrets behind our achievements, then perhaps we can direct the brain's strengths in careful, purposeful ways, opening a new chapter in the human story. Um, One thing about the brain that whenever I see a brain, like it's this like kind of ugly thing, right? Einstein's brain, I think, got put in a jar, right? I mean, this one of the most intelligent people ever lived, and his brain ended up in like this jar. And when you look at it, it's like this squishy but firm thing, and like all this, everything that we experience comes from that, and it's the most complex thing in the universe that we know of. As Carl Sagan would say, it's so far as the way the universe or nature has come to know itself. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, I think that the idea of brains being ugly, beauty and ugliness are kind of in the eye of the beholder. And from some perspectives, a brain is actually a very beautiful thing to look at, and especially when you start talking about the complexity of it and how it's arranged, the human brain in particular compared to some of the others. But yeah, definitely a subjective interpretation of beauty there.
well, yeah, I guess so. But for me, I mean, it's weird because like I look at beautiful women, I think that's the most beautiful thing in the universe. But
Hmm.
inside them, inside us, inside everything, it's kind of ugly. You know what I mean? You got organs and skulls, skeletons, and it's not the prettiest thing, at least from I think a lot of our perspectives. So
Right.
that's an interesting dichotomy, that contrast that you have there. Um,
It is. It's made even more
this
ironic.
next opening quote section is about the accuracy and
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say it was
Oh
made
yeah, I
even
was going
more
to get to
ironic.
the next section.
It was made even more ironic by the fact that it's your brain that actually does that. The fact that your brain is responsible for your perception of beauty and why we see the outside as more attractive than the inside.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But this next section is on the accuracy and reliability of reason, and I included it because you have this argument from theists about if your brain and how you perceive the world and your reason and your logic, if they are just a product of blind evolutionary deterministic chance, how can you rely on them, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and these two quotes kind of, I think, tear that down pretty nicely. The first one is from the Dragons of Eden that we mentioned from Carl Sagan. I think it's a pretty eloquent little quote. Those of our arboreal ancestors who had difficulty computing their trajectories as they brachiated from tree to tree did not leave many offspring. Natural selection has served as a kind of intellectual sieve, producing brains and intelligences increasingly competent to deal with the laws of nature. This resonance extracted by natural selection between our brains and the universe may help explain a quandary set by Einstein. The most incomprehensible property of the universe is that it's so comprehensible. So,
Yeah, and I think that some of the objection you tend to get with theists, particularly with that question dealing with the complexity of the brain and intelligence and consciousness and how it could arise from randomness, is how it's phrased a lot, is due to the fundamental lack of understanding of evolution and evolution by natural selection. That's something that tend to see a correlation between the lack of knowledge relating to evolution by natural selection and theistic ideas about the soul and the brain and the mind, and how it doesn't seem to make sense to them, how it could develop. It's kind of an argument of incredulity, really.
yeah, and really, if you look at the Bible, God is always tricking people and confusing people purposefully. So you could point that out. That's no
Yeah.
guarantee of anything, but yeah, evolution. If there's an evolutionary survival advantage to accurately diagnosing the world well enough, and obviously we don't perceive it exactly as it is. I mean, color is not even a thing, outside of our perception of it. It's like light waves bending and how we perceive them and all of that. But You know, obviously it has to be, we have to perceive it well enough. I mean, and this is evidence that we do by all that we've been able to do and build, you know, in civilization. So
Yeah. And I think you'll start finding, with at least with some of the more educated theists, or some of the more educated proponents of this idea of a soul, you'll find that most of their arguments come down to philosophical arguments related to qualia, which I think you're going to talk about later.
yeah. And then the second quote is it's just kind of reiterating what's already been touched on. It's from Richard Carrier in his book Defense of Metaphysical Naturalism, just saying that evolution is not random, though it's accidental. It produces what is conducive to survival. You know, and like I said, our sensory organs would be lethal if they were regular generators of false information. Yeah. And then
Yeah, and I think that that word randomness is really kind of throws a lot of people off, because
yeah,
people have this perception that it is random in the sense that it's unguided, but that's not really how randomness is used in science. That has more to do with unpredictability. But there is a predictability about evolution. At least the model is predictable, which is why it's a viable theory. So it's not random.
right. And this is just kind of a quote from Steven Pinker, the evolutionary psychologist, about how the mind is the activity of the brain. That, you know, there's overwhelming evidence that the mind is the activity of the brain, that the supposedly immaterial soul can be bisected with a knife, altered by chemicals, blows, electricity, or lack of oxygen. Under a microscope, the brain has a breathtaking complexity of physical structure, fully commensurate with the richness of the mind. It talks about how there's no special kind of spirit, matter, energy, but it's a different commodity, information. You know, why did brains evolve to start with? Well, because they were beneficial to our, you know, and to our ancestors. So yeah, and about
Yeah.
how our intelligence can be broken down into smaller networks.
Mhm.
Yeah, and then at
And
the
I would
science.
say that why did brains evolve? You said because they were beneficial to our ancestors. Yes,
Right,
that's true. But then someone else could come along with, well, why didn't other forms of life evolve brains if they were so beneficial? And so that, you know, there are situations where you have life that's divergent evolution, where certain populations of life in a different area may need certain evolutionary adaptations that another form of life doesn't have to deal with, you know. And so it was a
right.
requirement for this form of life to develop a brain in order to survive, whereas that other form of life didn't need that. And so, yeah.
Yeah, and of course, you know, other animals have brains, but if you look at like a fish, I don't think it has a cortex, cerebral cortex at all. You know, there are different needs and things that can push it one way or the other. Um,
Hmm.
then the scientific evidence against the blank slate and the ghost in the machine continue to pile up. The fields of cognitive, social, and affective neuroscience have been locating the physical substrates of ever more spiritual experiences, including empathy, moral reasoning, willed action, religious belief, and self-conscious reflection. Yeah,
Hmm.
I want to know, you know, when I think about God, right? The idea of God, you know, is just we know of no mind without a physical substrate. You know, we're going to get into some of the, like, you know, is it possible to download the brain later? But I mean, even in that scenario, there would still be some kind of physical substrate, right? Um, but even now, we know of no brain. We know mind without a brain. And when I think of the idea of God, it's like, what space is he in? Is he there, disembodied, sitting there alone and forever? And then one day he was bored and he decided to create this experiment to lord over and play hide and seek with. I mean, I think
Hmm.
a universe coming first and minds evolving in universes, that makes more sense and is far more backed up by evidence.
Yeah, and you wonder, when you start thinking about disembodied minds, you have to start asking yourself very basic questions like, how does a soul hear anything without ears? Or how does it see anything without eyes? How does it perceive anything without a brain? How does it interpret sensory information? Or is it capable of that? You know?
Right.
If God exists and he's only a soul with no physicality, and he sees everything and hears everything, what mechanism is he using to do this? What mechanism will we be using to do this once our soul is released from our body? You know, these are things that don't have any scientific explanation, but as far as I can tell, they don't even seem to have a theological explanation either.
Right.
I honestly wonder if it's a question that theists and people who believe in a soul have ever asked themselves. How does the soul work?
Yeah. How does that non-material thing affect the material?
Yeah,
And this was going back.
or even perceive the material. You know, if you don't have
Yeah.
eyes, if you don't have a brain to translate visual stimuli into information, how would the soul experience the physical universe?
Yeah. Going back to Descartes, right? And his dualism. I'm sure going back before that too, but yeah, nobody.
Yeah.
I think he said it was through the pineal gland, that to some kind of animal spirit or something. What Descartes said. He was just
You
making stuff
know,
up. I mean,
well, Descartes said some good things, but again, you know, all of the philosophers are ultimately products of their time, you know, and so their
yeah,
ability to think outside of the box is going to be limited the further back you go.
yeah,
Descartes said some great things like, I think, therefore I am. That's true. You know, if you're having an experience, you necessarily exist. Otherwise, there could be no experience.
well,
But any
about that,
idea,
I think you can say it's something seems to be experiencing something. I don't know if you can say I know I am because I know I am thinking, right? I think
well,
the
the
most you
key
can get is
there.
that something seems to be going on,
Right, right.
right?
There's
Right.
definitely something happening. There can't be nothing happening because then no
Yeah.
experience would be perceived.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the best that we can do.
Right. Well, getting into the soul kind of in depth now. There's a book called The Soul Fallacy by Julian Mussolino. It's
Mm-hmm.
really good. I mean, I think it's probably the go-to book for, what's wrong with the soul and why the scientific community does not accept it.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple quotes from the book. If our memories and consciousness are to survive death, as most religious people believe, then memory and consciousness must reside in some non-material entity. But if that's the case, then why do we lose memories when we experience brain trauma or disease or ingest drugs? If consciousness dwells in the soul, then why do we become unconscious under anesthesia or from a blow to the head? And I think that they were noticing this kind of stuff back going to like the Enlightenment period in the 1700s. Like there were cases where somebody they knew a little bit about the brain. I believe some of the like areas that pertain to certain functions. And
Mm-hmm.
like I think there was a guy that he was on a railroad or something, and he got a spike through his head, and it changed his personality and I mean, the brain is so malleable. You can become like a different person, right? And I believe if you cut the what's it called, the corpus callosum, like
Yep.
that unites the hemispheres. It's like
Mm-hmm.
you're the left and right side are like doing different things and not communicating. It's like two different people in there. So I mean, it's so malleable and
Well, I
uh,
think it wouldn't necessarily be two different identities when you sever the corpus callosum. They initially thought that at one point, and then they've determined that it's still the same identity, but the identity is using the different sides of its brain to perceive and interpret information differently. You know, and so asking someone who has that area of the brain severed to draw an elephant, or ask them what they see on the screen. If they see an elephant or a telephone, one side of the brain looking through one eye will interpret it as one thing versus the writing side of the brain that will interpret it as another. But I don't think I think the idea that it results in divergent identities has been disproved with the latest information. But it's
okay,
something to look out for because this is still being investigated. But it's a totally legitimate question to ask things like, where does your soul go when you are unconscious? You know, if you're
right.
passed out or you're under general anesthesia or in a coma, anytime where you lose time and you have no sense of perception or memory,
Or
where is
beyond
your
that, you have a
soul?
damage to a certain section corresponding to a certain function, right? Whether it's like facial recognition or memory, then that's
Mm-hmm.
damaged or gone. So I mean, that shows even more. And we can people obviously put people in like machines and like look at their brain activity, and it corresponds to certain areas where we think they should be and things of that nature. Um,
Right.
there's a good
But
quote later on
this is
from Brian Greene I had that kind of shows. Yeah, I mean, the brain is the
This
basis of the
is
mind.
somewhat
It's
argued with the concept of dualism, right? Because there's a lot of people who believe in the soul, but they also understand that the brain has functions. And I think that most of them are arguing that the two are intrinsically linked. And so that the soul is either doing something to affect the brain, or the soul is a response, is responding to what the brain is doing, things like that. But yeah, it's not necessarily that they're divorcing the idea that the brain has some sort of effect on the mind. It's just that they're adding this other component of a soul, seemingly
Mhm.
without justification.
And by the way, I think the idea of the soul, I mean, it's cool to maintain that as like a metaphor
Mm-hmm.
for, I don't know, your core essence or who you are or something like that. But I think it also invites confusion, and it invites people to carry the baggage that comes with the word. But I think, like the triune brain that we'll get into, that's been most of it kind of questioned and discarded. There are good things in there that are useful, um, especially the triune brain, but we'll get into that. The second quote just talks about how, we used to believe in the luminiferous ether in the 19th century, what this invisible substance with mysterious properties, in the soul. It's kind of like that thing just kind of faded away. And then he's talking about the new dualist, as I guess he calls them, that they're not they're not doing anything. They're pitching their extraordinary claims directly to the general public, and banking sometimes quite profitably on the fact that non-specialists will not be able to tell the difference between good science and bad science. So
Yeah, also known as appeals to pseudoscience, right?
right,
If
yeah,
you incorporate some scientific terminology into your unscientific proposal, then you can convince a lot of people that way.
yeah, absolutely. Getting into kind of five main points about the soul, why it's a fallacy, is the traditional soul is a testable hypothesis about the nature and functioning of the human mind. What then can we conclude about the existence of the soul? In a nutshell, science gives us every reason to believe the soul, like the emperor's new clothes and Anderson's famous tale, as a fiction. The key to understanding why mainstream science has abandoned the soul is the notion of consilience, the idea that evidence from multiple unrelated sources converge to support strong conclusions. And so, number one, the soul has shrunk as scientific understanding progressed. Work by anthropologists and religious historians reveals that before there was one soul, our soul, the soul, there were many souls. There were, I don't know if that's supposed to say free or tree, souls. So body souls, life souls, ego souls, and surviving souls. These different souls represented attempts on the part of our pre scientific ancestors to make sense of biological and psychological phenomena. With the advent of science, our ignorance began to diminish, and so did the number of souls. Biologists no longer speak of an elan vital or vital force. Vitalism is dead, and so are life souls. History teaches us that soul is simply a name we give to our ignorance of nature's ways. And today, the last frontier is the mind. So naturally, this is where people are looking for the soul.
Yeah, and in that way, it's the word soul, the way it's been used historically in this sense is very similar to the word supernatural. Anything supernatural or miraculous or magic, those are all words that are used to explain things about nature or the natural world that we don't actually understand.
Right. So there's no formalism that describes the soul substance. If someone is brilliant as Newton proposed an immaterial force, why not propose an immaterial soul? The key difference between gravity and the soul is that Newton offered a precise description of gravity, couched in the language of mathematics, which allowed him to make amazingly accurate predictions about the behavior of earthbound objects and celestial bodies. There are no soul equations or other formalism that make predictions about people's thoughts and behavior. And so the soul, unlike Newton's gravitation force, is useless. And you see this a lot, like here and like in creationism, like they're not doing their own work, and they're not doing something that you can, that for it's not falsifiable either, but they can't make predictions based on what they're saying, right?
Yeah, a lot of this is, well, I mean, look, a lot of theism is ultimately faith based, so they're not necessarily appealing to science when they talk about that. But on the rare cases where they do seem to be appealing to science, they will invoke people like Isaac Newton, who was a theist, but that's really more
Unorthodox theist, but yeah, he was a
he was an unorthodox theist. But they will say, look, even Isaac Newton believed in a god, and he discovered gravity, and gravity is scientific, and sort of.
Well, the thing is, they try to get into like intelligent design, and they try to make that out like it's science, but they can't do anything based off of it.
Yeah, and it's the they're appealing to the scientist rather than the scientific method, right? And so it's really kind of it's fallacious to say, look, Isaac Newton believed in God, he discovered gravity, gravity is real, he believed in the soul, therefore the soul is real. Obviously, that would be a fallacious argument, but they see it as science.
Yeah, number 3, there is no objective evidence that the soul exists. If there were credible evidence that we could talk to the dead, or that people undergoing out-of-body or near-death experiences can accurately report information available only to their floating soul, then the conclusion that the mind can operate independently from the body would receive some support. But in spite of sensational and well-publicized claims not taken seriously by the overwhelming majority of mainstream scientists, there is no such evidence. I remember Neil deGrasse Tyson was being asked about ghosts, like, how could you get me to believe in ghosts? And he's like, I don't know. Maybe next time a ghost talks to you, get some accurate, detailed information about, where they are, and what they're doing, and get some details so we can test. But we never seem to get, that. So.
Yeah, and you ran through that last quote pretty quickly, but I think it's important for people to understand, because a lot of people will appeal to near-death experiences as being the evidence for a soul. But the problem is that when we investigate the near-death experiences, or the visions, or the experiences that people seem to report when they're near death, they're not reliable. We can test whether or not they actually saw something that was placed in the room, after they were out, and they tend to fail the test. So it appears that near-death experiences are the result of lack of oxygen to the brain, affecting vision and memory, and nothing more. That's what it appears.
Right. So number 4, souls fly in the face of everything we know about modern science. In light of what we've learned about modern science, the claim that our mental lives are powered by an immaterial soul is supremely implausible. Biology teaches us that we evolved alongside millions of other species, and that we are the result of purely physical processes operating over a purely physical set of raw ingredients. There is therefore no room or need for anything like the soul. Mind-body dualism also flies in the face of what we know about physics. And it's referencing Sean Carroll, who talked about in his book, The Big Picture, how about the core theory, which shows like all the particles and forces of like everyday life, they're pretty much done and accounted for. I mean, there might be some definitely things we don't know, out there, and maybe even here, but not anything that's immediately relevant to like our everyday lives. Like that's pretty much worked out. And I know people many times in science have said, I mean, Lord Kelvin at the end of the 19th century said, "Oh, physics is dead," and all we're doing is like, looking at adjusting the decimal place and stuff like that, and then quantum physics happened. But I think there is some validity to what Carol's saying, about we're made of atoms, and we're made of mindless material, and we got a lot of this figured out, and it flies in the face of everything we know.
Yeah, and as true as all of that is, you'll still get someone coming along asking how mindless matter could give rise to the mind, and so that's the philosophical question that they are trying to have answered, that science on its own may not necessarily provide an answer for, but the lack of answer provided by science doesn't entitle someone else to make one up and just call it the soul. You still have to have some sort of evidence or rationale beyond you don't understand how it happened to come up with this and to justify that as an explanation.
Well, I think then there you get into like emergence and how we have I think I have a section on that later on, but we get things coming together from local bits that can conglomerate and get something more complex. But last one, there is overwhelming evidence for a materialistic account of the mind. The physical basis of mind is supported by an overwhelming amount of evidence from converging sources. Consilience at work again. Cut the brain in half, and you also slice the mind, as demonstrated by Roger Sperry's Nobel Prize-winning experiments with split brain patients. Damage a patch of the brain tissue, and a piece of the mind vanishes. Electrically stimulate the brain, and you can control people's thoughts and behavior. Put people in a brain scanner, and you can read some of their thoughts. Resurrect Rene Descartes, show him my iPhone 6, and he would have to conclude that there is a soul lurking inside. The divisibility and fragility of the mind control, mind reading, and intelligent machines are exactly what you would expect if our mental lives are indeed the product of our functioning brains. In sum, the soul has exactly the set of properties that it should have if it didn't exist. And this is why mainstream science has abandoned mind-body dualism.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that. It's unfalsifiable. What's the difference between a living being with a soul and a living being without a soul? And how do you tell the difference?
Yeah. And here's some additional comments on the soul. One of them is the doctrine of the sacredness of the soul sounds vaguely uplifting, but in fact is highly malignant. It discounts life on earth as just a temporary phase that people pass through, indeed an infinitesimal fraction of their existence. The gradual replacement of lives for souls as the locus of moral value was helped along by the ascendancy of skepticism and reason. And that's a good point people don't often consider, that, saying that the soul matters, not your life is a great way to sacrifice your life in many instances, right? And we can see that through history.
It is, at the very least, it devalues the lives that we have, that we know about here on Earth. It devalues this physical, earthly existence to where this is not really an important thing, and it's the next life, that our soul is trying to get to, that becomes important. It's kind of dangerous, especially when you don't know that there is a next life, and certainly have no reason to believe that there is one when we look at the science,
Right. Yeah, and then Sean Carroll talks about, you can either, the choice you're faced with becomes clear: either overthrow everything that we think we have learned about modern physics, or distrust the stew of religious accounts, unreliable testimony, wishful thinking that makes people believe in the possibility of life after death. It's not a difficult decision as scientific theory choice goes. And then Sam Harris says, much of what makes us much of what makes us human is generally accomplished by the right side of the brain. Consequently, we have every reason to believe that the disconnected right hemisphere is independently conscious, and that the divided brain harbors two distinct points of view. I think you said that's not necessarily true anymore. That was 2014 when that book came out, but
this is fairly accurate. I was speaking more in terms of identity and how people recognize themselves and their own ego as separate from the world. That's the thing that is, there doesn't seem to be a separation between. But as far as how the different hemispheres of the brain interpret information, yeah, that is correct. I mean, if you're viewing something, and someone asks you to say what you see and then write what you see at the same time, if they're functions of two different halves of the brain, you could be communicating two different things at the same time. You would still identify as the same person, but you're perceiving the same thing in a different way. So it's very complicated. I don't want to mess with people's minds too much.
Yeah.
So to speak. Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. And he says the idea of the soul arises from the feeling that our subjectivity has a unity, simplicity, and integrity, which it doesn't really have.
Yeah, some of these words are kind of, but I don't know. I don't really know what he means by integrity, or I don't know what he thinks that other people.
I guess it is secure, and it's unity, and it's a wholeness, and it's what's the word? That it's a continuous thing that
fully integrate. It sounds like he's saying integrity in terms that it's integrated.
Yeah.
Integrity is one of those words that has a couple of different meanings, and when we start talking about theological concepts, but
Right, but then this quote from Bill Bryson, what is perhaps most remarkable is that it is all just random, frantic action, a sequence of endless encounters directed by nothing more than elemental rules of attraction and repulsion. There is clearly no thinking presence behind any of the action of the cells. Trillions upon trillions of reflexive chemical reactions add up to a mobile, thinking, decision-making you. So.
Yeah, and I don't. Yes, I'm not sure how true the he put the word random in there, and I'm not sure if that's true or not. It may be random, or uh, it may be random in the sense that we cannot predict, what causes behaviors and thoughts and beliefs and all of that. We can't put that under a microscope, but it may be influenced by cause and effect. So.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know what he means by random there, but the rest of it I agree with.
Well, it's not guided by an agent, I guess.
Yeah, unguided by agency, true.
Yeah.
But that's a
Follow
certain
natural laws, but not unguided by its separate outside agency, I guess. Yeah.
Right.
So this is getting into the triune brain, which again has been largely discredited for a lot of its parts and aspects. So you have the neocortex, which is the newest part. Then you have the limbic system in the middle. Then you have the reptilian complex at the bottom, which is the oldest. It's kind of a note that I put in here that what I'm gathered from studying all this is that while the triune brain is no longer accepted in all its parts, it remains useful in showing all of the elements included in it that it got right, such as an older part of the brain responsible for automatic actions, the newest and most advanced part of the brain and the cortex involved in deliberation, logic, and reflection, and the limbic system is involved in emotion, fight or flight, child bonding, etc. And again, what I mentioned, the triune model still has its uses similar to how the soul can be used as a metaphor.
Yeah, and we should also maybe explain that when they use words like newer and older, they're not saying that one part of your brain is any newer than another part of your brain. They're talking about as far as when these parts of the brain and their functions evolved in nature. We tend to see the areas of the brain that we would call the neocortex. That is more of a recent development in evolution, and so therefore it's a newer part of the brain. But your brain and all of its parts are the same age.
Right. So yeah, I guess this is Carl Sagan commenting on that. After each evolutionary step, the older portion of the brain still exists and must be accommodated, but a new layer with new functions has been added. I think he said it's kind of like adding rooms to a house. Over time, you get newer parts. Yeah. And obviously, evolution can't ever start over from scratch. It has to work with what it has. So on the reptilian complex, it is it played an important role in aggressive behavior and ritual and establishing a social hierarchy. I believe it's supposedly, which I think is kind of accurate, though it's not necessarily reptilian, is that it regulates more automatic stuff like, again, sweating and breathing and things like that that don't require conscious deliberation.
Yeah.
And then he says, I do not mean that the neocortex is this is kind of a political point. So he's talking about social political behavior at modern human bureaucracy. I don't mean that the neocortex is not functioning at all in an American political conviction or a meeting of the Supreme Soviet. After all, a great deal of the communication as such rituals is verbal and therefore neocortical, but it is striking how much of our actual behavior, as distinguished from what we say and we think about it, can be described as reptilian in reptilian terms. We speak commonly of a cold-blooded killer. Machiavelli's advice to his prince was knowingly to adopt a beast. Yeah.
And so this again. So Carl Sagan, great cosmologist. How much he actually knew about biology or neurology, limited, right? So we're going to take that with a grain of salt. I don't know that the what he's when he's talking about the reptilian part of the brain, we just got finished talking about it as though it's regulating our basic functions and breathing and all of that. And so there isn't necessarily an emotional desire towards violence or anything like that associated with those parts of the brain. That would still be in a higher part of the brain where you have, neuroreceptors. Oh, it looks like you're about to talk about hormones right now. So,
and the limbic system, yeah. So the limbic system appears to generate vivid emotions. We have the amygdala and the limbic system, small almond-shaped thing in there, which is deeply involved in both aggression and fear. Electrical stimulation of the amygdala is in placid domestic animals can arouse them to almost unbelievable states of fear and frenzy. And so this is another part of, I think, the triune brain. I mean, it has parts of it that are still considered correct. Like, obviously we have the limbic system, and the amygdala is in the limbic system, right? And it's, it does pertain to, like, I think fight or flight and some of the emotional, like, chemicals and child bonding and things like that.
Yeah, and you see this in all animal species as well. It not necessarily in the same ways, but if you look at a cat, for example, humans and cats are obviously very different. But when you start examining cat behavior when it comes to parenting or the instinct to feed their young, this is very similar to what we experience, and it's because it's that part of their brain that's telling them, hey, it's time to nurse your children,
And this is just a quote about some of the basics of us being electrical. Most of these signals arrive by means of couriers called hormones, chemical entities such as insulin, adrenaline, estrogen, and testosterone that convey information from remote outposts like the thyroid and endocrine glands. You may not feel terribly electrical, but you are. The food we eat and the oxygen we breathe are combined in the cells into electricity. It's the occurrence of tiny scales that keep us from giving off, their occurrence on tiny scales that keep us from giving off massive shocks.
Yeah.
And then, our most human part of the brain, which again, I think this is pretty much accurate, the neocortex, the cortex, cerebrum, frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex. The frontal lobes seem to be connected with deliberation and the regulation of action. The parietal lobes with spatial perception and the exchange of information between the brain and the rest of the body. The temporal lobes with a variety of complex perceptual tasks, and the occipital lobes with vision, the dominant sense in humans and other primates. And even in fish, lesions of the forebrain destroy the traits of initiative and caution. In higher animals, these traits, much elaborated, seem localized in the neocortex, the site of many of the characteristic human cognitive functions. It is frequently discussed in terms of four major regions of lobes: the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes.
Right. And so your frontal lobe would be where cognition is generally happening. This is where thinking and reasoning, rationalism, that's the rational part of your brain for the most part.
Right.
That's kind of the area of the brain that separates us from most of the other animals. We can't say all of them, but certainly most of the other ones.
Right. And then a quote from Sagan about how superstition, pseudoscience, and religion is kind of a limbic or I think he said right brain exercise. It says the widespread acceptance of pseudoscience and religious explanations betokens a lack of intellectual rigor and absence of skepticism, a need to replace experiments with desires. These are by and large limbic and right hemisphere doctrines. They are dream protocols devised often in a way as to not be subject to disproof and impervious to rational discourse. In contrast, the aperture to a bright future lies almost certainly through the full functioning of the neocortex, reason alloyed with intuition and with limbic and R complex components, to be sure, but reason nonetheless, a courageous working through of the world as it is really seen. And I think some of what he's getting at there is reason is not everything. Reason by itself, completely devoid of context or goals or feelings, it's kind of useless, or worse than useless, I guess. But reason is the key ingredient to figuring things out, and therefore having a better life, working off of factual foundations and all that.
Yeah, and I would totally agree with, in particular, his second paragraph with respect to, the advantages of the neocortex and us leading it leading us to a more scientific approach and a more appreciation for reason. The first paragraph, though, could possibly be a little bit misleading when we start talking about the limbic system and some of the older, so to speak, areas of the brain being responsible for, beliefs in religion and pseudoscience. Not really. I mean, they may give us the instinct to seek out explanations for things that we don't understand, but in order to actually come up or posit an explanation, you still need that neocortex, right? Because you don't see animals worshiping gods or believing in the supernatural. At least there's no indication of that. It's still really kind of a human thing, right? So there's still a little bit of processing going on in that frontal lobe, even if it's incorrect processing or incorrect reasoning.
Yeah, Aldous Huxley had a quote about I can't remember how it went, but something about unlike animals, humans are the only ones too smart for their own good or something, and they start inventing things. I can't remember what he said.
Right.
But,
yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about there, because we still have the same instincts as animals, but if we don't know how to properly reason, we'll still seek to create an explanation for the things that we experience. And animals don't necessarily need to do that. They just want to either get away from the situation or find the food or find the mate, whatever the case may be, but they don't need to have reasons for, why what exists.
Right. These are just some pictures of, I guess, different parts of the brain in comparison with some of the other animals, and it's interesting the similarities and the differences.
Yeah, and they're very similar at a certain stage of development, right? In the fetal stage, there isn't too much difference between a human brain and the brain of a pig. What you have.
It's resemblance too. It's entire resemblance. Like I think all vertebrates are very similar.
Yeah, they are, and it's only through the arrangement of DNA where you start, having. It's basically programming your body to develop in a certain way and your brain to develop in a certain way. That's where the differences in brain development begin, but it's after a certain period of development, not before.
Yeah, and this is just kind of some details about the status of the Triune Brain model. Some of the research that's shown that's many parts of it aren't necessarily accurate. I guess if people want to, I'm not going to read all this. If people want to pause it and read it again, but also at the bottom it does point out that it's still the Triune model of the mammalian brain is seen as an oversimplified organizing theme by some in the field of comparative neuroscience, but it continues to hold public interest because of its simplicity. While inaccurate in many respects as an explanation for brain activity, structure, and evolution, it remains one of very few approximations of the truth we have to work with. The neocortex represents the cluster of brain structures involved in advanced cognition, including planning, modeling, and simulation. The limbic brain refers to those brain structures wherever located associated with social and nurturing behaviors, mutual reciprocity, and other behaviors and effects that arose during the age of the mammals. And the reptilian brain refers to those brain structures related to territoriality, ritual behavior, and other so-called reptile behaviors. So again, I mean, kind of discredited, but kind of also useful. And if you can kind of like put it an asterisk by it, and it can still be useful, basically.
Yeah, basically, this is the way that you want to teach it to like a teenager who's just learning about the brain and the relationship between brain and mind for the first time. You would start with that sort of explanation, and then if they continue on, then you would go into details about actually this is the neocortex, and that's different from the cerebellum and the medulla. So
right.
But yeah, so I do think it does have use for the layman, but really maybe not beyond that.
Just briefly about there are reasons to think that the beginnings of altruistic behavior are in the limbic system, indeed, with rare exceptions, chiefly the social insects. Mammals and birds are the only organisms to devote substantial attention to the care of their young, and evolutionary development that, through the long period of plasticity which it permits, takes advantage of the large information processing capability of the mammalian and primate brains. Love seems to be an invention of the mammals, This rule on the relative parental concern of mammals and reptiles is, however, by no means without exception. Now, crocodile mothers carefully put their fresh hatchlings in their mouths and carry them to the comparative safety of the river waters, etc.
Yeah, and I may take objection to love seems to be a mammalian invention. I think it's probably a bird invention as well. Crows, for example, or members of the corvid family, crows, ravens, and jays. You know, crows hold funerals for their dead. They're one of the only other animals besides humans, and I think elephants and chimpanzees that do that as well. So it's not strictly a mammalian invention, but the overall point is taken.
And just a couple quotes speaking to the fact that a rainbow unwoven is no less beautiful and is more useful. And then sometimes the most selfish thing a gene can do is build a selfless brain, and that just gets into the fact that their cooperation is often the will be selected for, and is, you know, we need to cooperate. We're a social species, and all of that.
Go back to that first quote for a second. What do you think that quote means?
Which
unwoven,
one?
The unwoven rainbow.
Well, people try to say that science dehumanizes, or it makes things I don't know, emotionless or whatever, or it removes the wonder, and not really. I mean, understanding a rainbow doesn't take away from its beauty. I mean, it can add to it, and also when you understand the way something works, that's more useful than just merely gazing in awe, you know, at it. You could potentially, from that information, and we have, built things that are also beautiful or more beautiful if we understand how a certain beautiful thing, you know, works.
Yeah, as somebody who used to be a theist, I used to be a Christian at one point, and I'm an atheist now. But the way, when I look at a statement like that, I had a certain perception of rainbows when I was a theist, when I was a Christian, because it's generally taught in Christianity that a rainbow has meaning. You know, a rainbow means God's promise not to flood the world. And so it has beauty not only in its vision, but also in its meaning. And then when you start, you know, a theistic argument would be to say, well, if you start taking that apart and looking at it through a scientific lens, it loses all meaning. And now, as an atheist who appreciates science, I would completely disagree with that, because it's, as you said, we can understand why a rainbow happens, what causes it, why it's beautiful, be able to predict them in the future, be able to create them if we want to. And so it's just as beautiful to me now as it was when I was a theist.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. These are some pages from The Better Angels of Our Nature: Why Violence Has Declined by Steven Pinker. He's probably my favorite contemporary author. This book is probably my favorite book of all time and the most inspiring. I mean, I have to say I agree with Bill Gates. He made the same comment. It's a kind of a massive work of history and psychology with a lot of uplifting facts and eloquently expressed facts. But he says human nature is the problem, but it is also the solution, which I think is true. So this is, you know, the parts of the brain that are relevant to aggression and violence. The rat brain has been carried over to the human brain, including the organs that house the circuits for rage, fear, and dominance: the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the periaqueductal gray, which is found inside the midbrain, lining the cerebrospinal canal running through it. The dopamine-fueled, I don't know some of these words, striatum, whose ventral portion helps set goals for the whole brain to seek, is also prominent. But while these structures take up a large proportion of the rat brain and the human brain, they are enveloped by a bloated cerebrum. The outside cerebral cortex has been wrinkled like a wad of newspaper to get it to fit inside the skull. A large part of the cerebrum is taken up by the frontal lobes, which in this view of the brain extend about 3/4 of the way back. The neuroanatomy suggests that in Homo sapiens, primitive impulses of rage, fear, and craving must contend with the cerebral restraints of prudence, moralization, and self-control, though as in all attempts at taming the wild, it's not always clear who has the upper hand. Then he says scientists have known that the orbital cortex is involved with regulating the emotions since 1848. So.
Yeah. And this is great because it's basically talking about instincts and the ability of certain animals to fight natural instincts. You know, an instinct is basically your biological programming to seek a certain behavior or to avoid a situation, fight or flight, eat or starve. You know, I'm thirsty, therefore I need to drink. The basic biological urges and instinctive responses. With the neocortex and the frontal lobe in particular, and humans, we have the ability to override that, you know, and so it's not just a matter of hardware programming us to behave in a certain way. We do have that. I like to call it firmware. We do have those instincts, but we also have a brain, and we can think and consider the consequences of our actions. So they can be overridden.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of other animals can't really do it the way that we can.
Right. Uh, this might be covering some things I've already touched on, about the amygdala. Uh, in the case of humans, for example, the amygdala responds to an angry face. You know, it's funny. Many years ago, I used to do music. I've always been a writer, and I wrote music, and I recorded some of it years ago in a kind of an album. And one of the songs that I wrote and that I recorded, actually, and it's on my channel in a section called "The Weapon Is Thought." There's a song called "Unmutual Rumination," and it's just a song about that I wrote about how people, when they see each other, they judge people's facial expressions and then take actions based off of it. And so, but they constantly misjudge people. Like, you don't know where somebody has just been. You don't know what exactly they're thinking, or if what they're thinking or how they appear has anything to do with you. I mean, all of these, details that we don't really consider, and oftentimes we miss out on opportunities because we do that, too quickly, and how we judge people. I mean, I guess we kind of it's kind of evolutionary in a way. We have to make quick decisions, and it can stem from that. But if you think things through a little more, it can be more helpful. But yeah, we are in, as I put it, unmutual rumination, out of sync with each other.
Yeah, and some people are better at this than others. I mean, there's this concept in psychology called system one thinking versus system two thinking, right? And in system one thinking, that's the quick thinking where you have to necessarily make quick judgments, and out of necessity. And some people are more inclined to do that even when it's not necessary, you know. And so this is how you can look at someone who has what we call RBF, resting bitch face, and just assume the worst about them.
Right.
Whereas if you actually, thought about it a little bit longer and considered the circumstance, consider, how long they've looked like that, how well you know them, whether you've had a conversation with them, maybe what it appears isn't necessarily the case, and so you would be more inclined to reserve judgment.
Yeah. And it's sitting on top of the entire rage circuit is the cerebral cortex, the thin layer of gray matter on the outer surface of the cerebral hemispheres, where the computations behind perception, thinking, planning, and decision making occur. And then there's one quote here about it's not necessarily pertaining to the brain, but just the point that 97% of your DNA consists of nothing but long stretches of meaningless garble, junk, even as full-time occupants within the cell, each strand of DNA is being attacked or damaged on average every 8.4 seconds. So, continuing on with violence, a couple quotes from Pinker. Since violence is largely a male pastime, cultures that empower women tend to move away from the glorification of violence. And also the theory that religion is a force for peace, often heard among the religious right and its allies today, does not fit the facts of history.
No, I mean, who are the leaders of all of the religions? Males or females?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I mean, I think I saw a quote from the Daily Show. Haven't men started all wars in human history?
Yeah. Well, there used to be like a mother goddess thing that was very prominent even before the patriarchal religions with the thunder gods and all of that. And I mean, there was still a lot of violence, but and violence is, of course, much better today, much reduced. But there was a time when we had mother goddesses everywhere. And I I think things were pretty different, and a lot of times women were viewed as kind of like this magical, because people didn't know at one point the male involvement in creating life, right? And they just knew it came out of the woman, right? So they didn't know necessarily how that worked.
Yeah, I'm not sure to what extent that part is true, but certainly they would have viewed the woman's role in being the giver and nurturer of life as much more relevant than the man's role, you know.
Right. Yeah.
But at the same time, men being typically the more aggressive, the more testosterone laden entity, through that aggression assumed power, and therefore the woman and the female gods kind of died and were replaced by the males, who overpowered them and became the dominant in society.
Right. It says here each cerebral hemisphere is divided into lobes. Already kind of went over that. The frontal lobe computes decisions relevant to how to behave. The connections are all two-way. There is considerable feedback and cross-talking among these components and with other parts of the brain. Hey, this is the part that I kind of missed. What is the distinction between the left and right hemispheres? Because I know the left hemisphere is supposed to be more of a certain thing, and the right hemisphere is supposed to be more of a certain a certain way. Like, what is the thing there? Like, it's
Yeah, basically, their different functions of the brain are located in the different hemispheres, right? So your artistic side, the of your brain is located on the opposite hemisphere from your more logical or rational side, and so things related to the arts, music, religious experiences, philosophy, things like that would be associated with one area of the brain versus mathematics, reason, and things of that nature. And it escapes me right now which side is which, so I don't want to get more detailed than that. But the idea that certain types of thinking and behaviors are associated with areas of the brain that are different from each other, and that's pretty much all it is.
right.
Right brain versus left brain. If you're left brain, and I think the left brain is I can't remember which one it is. I can't remember if that's the logic side or the artistic side, but whatever, if you are more like of the arts, then you're said to be left brain or right brain, whichever side that is. But don't quote me on which side, because it's been a minute.
Okay. Gotcha. The geneticist Theodosius Domansky famously wrote that nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution, and we can add that nothing in culture makes sense except in the light of psychology. Evolution created psychology, and that is how it explains culture. The most important relic of early humans is the modern mind, and I guess this is just speaking to evolution produced us, therefore our psychology ties in some very relevant, central, salient way to our mind, to our evolutionary history.
Who wrote
That's
that?
Yeah, this came out really blurry. That's from How the Mind Works by Steven Pinker.
Okay. Yeah, there's again, it's kind of basic. I would say that sociology and anthropology probably have those are the fields that deal with culture and have the explanations for culture. Psychology is relevant in both of them, but psychology in and of itself doesn't necessarily explain culture, because we're still learning about it, but two, psychology explains why we think the way that we do, or how we've come to be thinking the way that we do, but not necessarily how thinking agents relate to other thinking agents in any historical context. That would be more sociology.
Okay. Just a couple quotes about religion here. It kind of appeals to the enchantment of story, the inclination to endow agency, the comfort of ritual, the appetite for explanation, the security of community. And then it's natural to think that living things must be the handiwork of a designer, but it was also natural to think that the sun went around the earth. Overcoming naive impressions to figure out how things really work is one of humanity's highest callings.
Yeah, I mean, it's intuitive. it's intuitive that the sun revolves around the earth. That's what it looks like. That's what it seems to be. And if
Right.
but for science, we would continue to believe that. But through
This is more
historical
evidence.
observation and tracking,
Yeah, this is
sorry.
more evidence that reason is not from some and doesn't need some divine foundation, that it's an evolutionary product, and it was home to our environment. That's why the findings of science, like on very large, small, and fast scales, are counterintuitive. They escape our intuitive grasp because our reason was home to, I think it's Richard Dawkins calls it Middle Earth, like things that helped us survive, that were in our immediate experience. But we can extrapolate from that base, and we can, invent technology and things like that to help us understand, things that go beyond that. But that's just more evidence, that it's like everything is from evolution. That,
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's important to keep in mind as not to straw man all theists. There are many theists who accept evolution, and they accept that all of these things are emergent properties from, evolution by natural selection. I think that the difference is they're associating evolution with some sort of a mind agency or will that pre-exists all of everything that evolved, and that's the thing that we don't really have evidence for, or maybe even a good reason to believe that.
yeah. This is interesting, like why do we like sugar so much? Because, sugar is bad for us, things like that, inheriting our traits from our past. So this is a quote from Brian Greene from Until the End of Time, which is a really good book that kind of like Sean Carroll's Big Picture, touches like on like all of science, and it's really in depth and really well written. Um, but he says those of our forebears who enjoyed loading up on rich sources of energy like fleshy fruit could better cope when days turn lean, thus producing more prophecy and propagating. I think I should say progeny, and propagating a genetic predilection for fats and sweets, a modern relic of yesteryear's vital scavenging for calories. Our actions result from a complex amalgam of biological, historical, social, cultural, and all manner of chance influences that are imprinted on our particle arrangement. But our tastes and instincts are an essential part of the mix, and in the service of survival, evolution had a strong hand in shaping them. We can learn new tricks, but genetically and hence instinctually speaking, we are old dogs. So like we have kind of flown the nest of evolution in a lot of ways, and we'll get into some of this later too. But um, a lot of our instincts and genetically, we're still from a time was the majority of our history where we lived very differently, right? And we were nomadic, and we were hunter gatherers, and all of that.
Yeah, that's true. But we can even see some changes in human inclination for food preferences based on looking at humanity in through a more recent lens. When you look at some cultures, for example, they are more inclined to enjoy spicy foods or salty foods than others. When you look at people who exist or who came from cultures that were situated around the equator, for example, the Middle East, Central America, things like that. They tend to have spicier food there versus people in Northern Europe, for example, and
Right.
that's the cultural, the socio-cultural element where you had to use, you had to cure your meats and you had to use a lot of salts and spices to preserve it in the hot weather. Whereas in the upper latitudes, they didn't really have to do that, and so historically, people from Northern Europe may not be they don't have the palate for the spicy food that the people from the latitudes nearer to the equator do, just because traditionally they wouldn't have had those kinds of foods.
I believe one of the examples of more modern evolutionary change in modern humans is stemming from the agricultural revolution, lactose tolerance, right? I believe used to we could not process lactose, and now many people can, stemming from domesticating cows and all of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly an evolution. Look, we can still see evolution happening in humans today, and that's one of the great examples of it. Mammals are not just humans, but all mammals. We are not designed to be able to process lactose after a certain stage of development. When you're a baby, that's what you drink, and you have the enzymes in your stomach to break that down. But then once you mature into adulthood, you lose the ability to do that, or most mammals do. Humans in some capacity have started to retain this, or through genetic mutations, some have, and, whatever the case may be. But because we continue to drink milk in adulthood, which is not normal in the animal world, but we've kind of created this idea that drinking milk is something to be drank. So yeah, but most people are still lactose intolerant, which is funny.
Yeah. This is another quote from How the Mind Works. The design of our own minds gives us paradoxes, brain teasers, myopias, illusions, irrationalities, and self-defeating strategies that prevent rather than guarantee the meeting of our everyday needs. But what about the Darwinian imperative to survive and reproduce? As far as day-to-day behavior is concerned, there is no such imperative. People watch pornography when they could be seeking a mate, forego food to buy heroin, sell their blood to buy movie tickets. In India, postpone childbearing to climb the corporate ladder and eat themselves into an early grave. Human vice, although we can talk about what qualifies as vice, I think anything that's consensual and not harmful, is not vice. But anyway, human vice is proof that biological adaptation is, speaking literally, a thing of the past. Our minds are adapted to the small foraging bands in which our family spent 99% of its existence, not to the topsy-turvy contingencies we have created since the agricultural and industrial revolutions. Before there was photography, it was adapted to receive visual images of attractive members of the opposite sex because those images arose only from light reflecting off fertile bodies. Before opiates came in syringes, they were synthesized and the brain is natural analgesics. Before there were movies, it was adapted to witness people's emotional struggles because the only struggles you could witness were among people you had to psych out every day. Before there was contraception, children were unpostponable, and status and wealth could be converted into more children and healthier ones.
Yeah.
Yeah. The world outside your head. Because our perception, our brain is enclosed in a dark, kind of skull casing. So how much does it match up? So what does the world outside your head look like? Not only is there no color, some of this guy can't see it, but there is no sound. The compression and expansion picked up by the ears and turned into electric signals. The brain then presents these signals to us as mellifluous tones and swishes and clatters and jangles. Reality is also odorless. There's no such thing as smell outside our brains. Molecules floating through the air bind to receptors in our nose and are interpreted as different smells by our brain. The real world is not full of rich sensory events. Instead, our brain lights up the world with their own sensuality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Memory. I don't know if you're a sci-fi fan, but this is from Doctor Who. Yeah, I always like this quote.
Not specifically a Doctor Who fan, but I am a sci-fi fan.
Right. I'm a big Star Trek fan. That's so.
I'm a big Star Trek fan too.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, it's probably my favorite franchise. But yeah, this from Matt Smith. Matt Smith, by the way, is an atheist. His doctor from Doctor Who, he said, because the doctor can change, into a new body, but it's still the same person or whatever. And in a way, we're kind of like that. He said we all change when you think about it. We're all different people all through our lives, and that's okay. That's good. You got to keep moving so long as you remember all the people that you used to be.
Which doesn't always happen. That's not, in fact, usually that's not the case, right? We don't always remember all of the people that we used to be. We think we do, but memory is not as tricky because it's not necessarily accurate.
Mm-hmm. So am I the sum of my memories? Our brains and bodies change so much during our life that like a clock's hour hand, it's difficult to detect the changes. Every 4 months, your red blood cells are entirely replaced, for instance, and your skin cells are replaced every few weeks. Within about 7 years, every atom in your body will be replaced by other atoms. Physically, you are constantly a new you. Fortunately, there may be one constant that links all these different versions of yourself together: memory. Perhaps memory can serve as the thread that makes you who you are. It sits at the core of your identity, providing a single continuous sense of self. But there might be a problem here. Could the continuity be an illusion? Imagine you could walk into a park and meet yourself at different ages in your life.
Mm-hmm.
And some of this got cut, but you, man, you possess all the your life's memories might have less in common than expected. Your memory of who you were at 15 is different from who you actually were at 15. Moreover, you'll have different memories that relate back to the same events. Why? Because of what a memory is and isn't. Rather than a memory being like an accurate video recording of a moment in your life, it is a fragile brain state from a bygone time that must be resurrected for you to remember. So.
Yeah, and I use this example all the time. This idea of the different you that existed as a 15-year-old versus the you that exists now. You really are a completely different person, physically and mentally and emotionally. Really, in every way that we would describe personhood. The only common thread is the continuity of existence in the physical sense. But beyond that, in what way are you the same person, especially if your memories are different, right? If you have a different memory of when it was for you to be 15 than what actually was when you were 15, are you the same? If so, in
Yeah.
what way? If you, especially, what if you have different beliefs, different knowledge, different motivations,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's really interesting. Um, this is people use the brain as a city. Look at your brain as like a city. It's a good way to think about it. So brains tend to be squishy. They don't leave distinct impressions in the fossil record, but the brain itself preserves its evolutionary past. New York City is an apt metaphor for the brain growing from a settlement to a world capital through a series of unplanned developments. Neither the brain nor the city can be shut down for repairs and enhancements. The older limbic system must continue working perfectly while the much more recent cerebral cortex evolves. And then kind of the same thing. Think of the brain as a city. If you ask where is the economy located, you see there's no place where the economy is located. Instead, the economy emerges from the interaction of all the elements. And
Mm-hmm.
so it is with the brain's operation. It doesn't happen in one spot. Just as in a city, no neighborhood of the brain operates in isolation. In brains and in cities, everything emerges from the interaction between residents at all scales, locally and distantly. Just as trains bring materials and textiles into a city, which become processed into the economy, so the raw electrochemical signals from sensory organs are transported along superhighways of neurons. There, the signals undergo processing and transformation into our conscious reality.
Yeah, I really like that analogy too, especially, the question, where's the economy located? Because
Yeah.
most people who know anything about economics would say that, yeah, cities have economies, nations have economies. But then if you ask a simple question like, okay, where is it? They wouldn't be able to point to it, and this is very
All right.
similar to that idea of people having a consciousness or qualia about them. It's not something that you can actually point to. You can just acknowledge it as a series of events occurring in the brain that give rise to this concept that we call consciousness or qualia.
Right.
So I think I'm going to steal that.
Yeah. Just about basic technical stuff here. The connections between neurons are called synapses. These connections are where chemicals called neurotransmitters carry signals between neurons. Your heart beats and your brain thinks because those ancient microbes got together and became something much more complex. That's what happens when living things and environments interact over the course of eons. The resulting entities become more than the sum of their parts, the phenomenon known as emergence. The neurons and their parts, axons, dendrites, synapses, and the cell bodies themselves make up a network in the brain. This is the essence of emergence, tiny units of matter operating collectively to become something much more than themselves to enable the cosmos to know itself. From Andrew.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. I was kind of skimming through that. I didn't see it mention neural pathways, but really that's the key, right? It isn't just the fact that we have neurons and the synapses between them, but that we actually develop neural pathways that correspond with learning. This is the learning process. Do you remember the movie Terminator 2? Have you
It's
seen
been a
that?
long time, but yeah, I remember it.
Arnold Schwarzenegger basically
Right.
says my CPU is a neural net processor, you know. But and it's kind of a funny line, but it's significant because that's exactly the way that the brain works. The more you engage in a process of learning, or when you encounter repeated stimuli to where you can make predictions, you're developing pathways in your brain where one neuron is connecting to another, in a same path, to where you can just sort of repeat these behaviors later on. You don't have to develop that pathway in the future, and that's how we learn.
Right. This is just about brain plasticity, about how your brain can continue to, I guess, change, take an input and change based off the its plasticity. Uh, and this quote is not really relevant to that, but it's a good quote. It's from Andrew Yen in her book Cosmos Possible Worlds. She said people kept telling me that my son Sam's fate, who was sick, was in God's hands. They offered to pray, but I can't help but think that if this had befallen Sam a century ago, he'd be dead. What has changed in this relatively brief time? Not God, presumably, only our knowledge of medical science and our technology to implement what we know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, and I think the plasticity of the brain is kind of piggybacking of what I've said before, and how learning occurs. You know, every time you learn something new, your brain is changing physically, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can learn new things, you can unlearn other things, you can forget, you know.
Right. This is getting into Freud and the unconscious. So, I mean, Freud, man, he had some bogus, strange ideas. I mean,
He did.
he had the parents, children desiring their parents. Was that the Oedipus
Yeah, yeah.
complex? And
Yeah, and he has, yeah, a lot. So a lot of his theories about psychosexual development have been discredited, but some of his methodology is still relevant because he did pioneer the concept of psychoanalysis, which we still use today to diagnose people, right?
mm-hmm.
From mental disorders and to treat people. So Freud is still relevant, although a lot of his ideas about why people thought what they did would largely be considered discredited today.
Yeah, these pages kind of focus on what he got right, and in a general sense, is that the unconscious is a big part of us, and the unconscious is a big part of what goes on. So, before Freud, aberrant mental processes went unexplained or were described in terms of demonic possession and weak will and so on. Freud insisted on seeing the cause in the physical brain. He
Mm-hmm.
became convinced that the conscious mind is the tip of the iceberg on of our mental processes, while the much larger part of what drives our thoughts and behaviors lies hidden from view. Freud's speculation turned out to be correct, and one consequence of that is that we don't uh, typically have access to the roots of our own choices. Um, yeah, yeah, but
Yeah, and
that's an important point.
I have some thoughts about that later. I'll wait until you get finished your slide
Oh,
presentation.
I think
Yeah.
I'm done. I mean, it's just kind of just repeating what I said before. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, when you, gosh, where do I start? So, when we're talking about consequences for our actions, and you know, we're going back to the soul for a minute, but it's like, you know, most people who believe in a soul, I think, believe that the soul is something to be judged by a god at some point, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at all of the things that make up a soul, which is, you know, your knowledge, your experiences, your memories, your beliefs, a lot of these things are not in our control. You know, beliefs, for example, we can't control our beliefs. It's kind of a nonsensical but common idea that people choose what they believe. You don't really. You know, a belief is something that you are convinced of, but external things convince you, you know. And so you don't necessarily choose your beliefs, your experiences, you know. Believing is really a state of existence which results in being convinced of the truth of something, and that's not always in your hands. And you look at like causality, right? Causality influences the circumstances that we find ourselves in, and we don't really have control over every chain of events that influences where we find ourselves. So
Right.
if beliefs aren't choices, and your genetic inheritance wasn't a choice, and the circumstances of your birth and where you were born, your citizenship, if none of these things are choices, then what are we being judged on? We can't be reasonably responsible for anything that we believe or think or know, nor intrinsically accountable for any of that. So then what's the point of the judgment? And then when I talk to theists about this, I tend to ask them, we didn't create our soul, if there was such a thing. God did, right? We didn't make souls immortal. God did that. We didn't determine that the circumstances of when and where we get our soul. This is something that was all in God's hands. So if we have no capacity to determine the events that influence our soul, then why would we be held accountable for it? It really kind of doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. I recently read Sam Harris's book on free will, and I had a long discussion like 3 or 4 podcasts ago about it. It gets into a lot of what you were touching on, how so much of everything is not in our control. We're not the conscious author of, so much. And there's like a string of causes that go back, an ocean of causes that we're not, you know, responsible for or often even aware of. So, yeah.
Right. And so, I think that, we spent a lot of time talking about the soul, but we didn't, I think maybe the thing that we didn't do was define what it is that we're talking about, or what it is that we think people who believe in a soul are talking about. Because I find that soul is used in 2 different ways when I talk to people who believe in it. The soul is either the thing that gives rise to qualia, or the thing that gives rise to sentience and sapience, or it's the qualia itself, right? So, like,
Right.
sometimes people have this idea that the soul is this invisible external agency that gives rise to mind and consciousness, and then they'll call that your soul. But then other people say that the soul is the mind and the consciousness. So which one is it? It kind of depends on the person, and sometimes there can be some equivocation going on there. But it can't be both. It has to be one or the other. If
Right.
it's the thing that gives rise to mind and consciousness, then it has to be separate from mind and consciousness. And if it is mind and consciousness, then it didn't give rise to itself.
Yeah,
So,
that's a good segue to the next slide here. A lack of consciousness. So, quote from Brian Greene again. We need to set aside the notion that our choices and decisions and actions have their ultimate origins within each of us, that they are brought into being by our independent agencies, that they emerge from deliberations that stand beyond the reach of physical law.
mhm.
So, and then from this book, The Brain, um, these kinds of experiments reveal something fundamental about how brains operate. The job of this organ is to gather information about the world and steer your behavior appropriately. It doesn't matter if your conscious awareness is involved or not. And most of the time, it's not. Most of the time, you are not aware of the decisions being made on your behalf. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I don't got time to get deep into free will again, but it is a challenging and fascinating subject, definitely.
Hmm.
And here, of course, humans are storytellers. I mean, we've been storytellers going back. It has to do with the we're patternicity, we're pattern seeking too, and just how we put things, perceive things, we put them in narratives. So we can't help but impose stories from time immemorial. People have watched the flight of birds, the movement of stars, the sways of trees, and invented stories about them, interpreting them as having intention. This kind of storytelling is not just a quirk, it's an important clue into brain circuitry. It unmasks the degree to which our brains are primed for social interaction. After all, our survival depends on quick assessments of who is friend and who is foe.
Hmm.
And then,
And that would be your system one, quick thinking.
yeah. And then storytelling may be the mind's way of rehearsing for the real world. Um, Through language, story explodes the limits that would otherwise be imposed by our own narrow experience. The storytelling impulse is a human universal. We take in the world through our senses, and pursuing coherence and envisioning possibility, we seek patterns, we invent patterns, and we imagine patterns. With story, we articulate what we find. We have an innate tendency to ascribe a mind to anything we encounter that even hints of having agency. Other minds can generate behaviors we're better off anticipating. Same goes for animals. When assigning agency in the wild, better to over endow than to under endow.
Mm.
Yep.
Yeah.
Reason and emotion, just this is kind of about, how they're both important, basically. So the world would not be better off if we all behave like robots. The ancient Greeks suggested that we should think of our lives like chariots. We are charioteers trying to hold two horses, the white horse of reason and the black horse of passion. Each horse pulls off center in opposite directions, and your job is to keep control of both horses, navigating down the middle of the road. Then a couple quotes. This is from Steven Pinker. The indispensability of reason does not imply that individual people are always rational or are unswayed by passion and illusion. It only means that people are capable of reason and that a community of people who choose to perfect this faculty and to exercise it openly and fairly can collectively reason their way to sounder conclusions in the long run. As Lincoln observed, you can fool all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool some. You can I didn't get that right. You can fool all of the people some of the time, and you can fool some of the people all the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And then this quote is from a book about the radical enlightenment from Philip Bloom, who I actually interviewed on my channel months back, about kind of the radical, the atheist, and the Enlightenment. And it wasn't all about reason; it was about passion also. So he says, the vision discussed around Dolbach's, who is an atheist, dinner table was one in which women and men would no longer be oppressed by the fear and ignorance instilled by religion, but could instead live lives to the full. Instead of sacrificing their desires to the vain hope of reward in an afterlife, they would be able to walk freely, to understand their place in the universe as intelligent machines of flesh and blood, and pour their energies into building individual lives and communities based on their inheritance of desire, empathy, and reason. Desire, erotic and otherwise, would make the world beautiful and rich. Empathy would make it kind and livable. Reason would make an understanding of the world's immutable laws. Before this vision could be reached, the enemies of reason and desire had to be defeated. The church condemned desire as lust and reason as pride, mortal sins both, and perverted empathy. So,
yeah, and unfortunately, through that tradition and just the fact that some people don't want that to be true is why we can't move in that direction, as a unified, cohesive human culture. Religion is pervasive and insidious that way. But
yep.
Yeah.
About qualia, subjective experience, we don't necessarily understand it completely, but there have been attempts made to say, in quantum physics, like the experiment where you're measuring of a quantum indeterminacy seems to snap the indeterminacy into a determined state, right? And people try to say, oh, this shows consciousness is like fundamental to reality. And I don't know of any scientist who goes along with that. And Brian Greene here is kind of just articulating that. He's saying, in my decades of immersion in quantum mechanics, I've seen nothing to shift my long-held assessment of the link between consciousness and quantum physics. Extraordinarily unlikely. When a quantum system is prodded, whether the prodder is a conscious being or a mindless probe, the system snaps out of the probabilistic quantum haze and assumes a definite reality. Interactions, not consciousness, coax the emergence of definite reality. So,
yeah, and I don't know enough about quantum physics to speak intelligently about the validity of that statement, and I'm not really sure if he's advocating for this idea that quality has a scientific explanation or if he's saying that it doesn't.
Well, he's just saying that he doesn't subscribe to these people that try to say, oh, quantum mechanics is strange and mysterious, and so is consciousness, and maybe because we can affect the state of the quantum thing by looking at it, that means consciousness is like this fundamental thing, and we can change reality with our consciousness. that, you know, he doesn't subscribe to that's and really nobody does. But certain
Yeah,
people,
and
often not
frankly,
scientifically informed, do. So
right. And a lot of scientists don't even, or I should say philosophers, because now we're getting into philosophy. A lot of
yeah.
philosophers don't necessarily, um, believe in the hard problem of consciousness either. It is a relatively new invention, and it is accepted by some philosophers, but rejected by others. So the idea that qualia cannot be the result of emergent processes, some people believe that, and others don't.
Right. This other quote is talking about
I should have
you
said
know,
it couldn't be accounted for through natural processes, but
right.
sorry.
So how does something as rich as the subjective feeling of being me, the sting of pain, the redness of red, the taste of grapefruit, arise from billions of simple brain cells running through their operations? After all, each brain cell is just a cell following local rules, running its basic operations. By itself, it can't do much. So how do billions of these add up to the subjective experience of being me? So
Yeah, and there's two problems with that. One, we can't necessarily answer that, but we can draw some parallels. We can ask similar questions about how billions of molecules of water result in the quality of wetness. One
right, right,
molecule of
right,
water isn't wet, but wetness is something that we feel when we experience a bunch of molecules put together. So it's definitely an emergent property. But the
hmm
other problem with that is, even if we had no explanation, the people who are positing the idea of a soul or theistic explanations, they don't really have an explanation either. They're just kind of making something up because we don't have a scientific explanation, and you can't do that.
right. Yeah, that gets us into emergence,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's probably the best answer for it, right? Um, quote from Sean Carroll: "In both physics and biology, complexity often emerges in a hierarchical fashion. Small pieces conglomerate into larger units, which then conglomerate into even larger units. Networks are built up that exhibit complex overall behavior emerging from simple underlying rules. The appearance of complexity isn't just compatible with increasing entropy, it relies on it. We are ephemeral patterns of complexity riding a wave of entropy. We should enjoy the ride." Um,
Mm-hmm.
and then here, although your goals, intentions, and abilities are completely dependent on the existence of these little neurons, they live on a smaller scale with no awareness of the thing they have come together to build. But get enough of these basic brain cells together interacting in the right ways, and the mind emerges. Everywhere you look, you can find systems with emergent properties. No single hunk of metal on an airplane has the property of flight, but when you arrange the pieces in the right way, flight emerges. Pieces and parts of a system can be individually quite simple. It's all about their interaction. In many cases, the parts themselves are replaceable. So,
Yeah, it's again going back to the analogy with the city and the economy. There's nothing in the city that you can call the economy, but you can definitely see an economy emerging from the inner workings of the people living in the city and outside of it.
right. So, the connectome, they're trying to map the connectome. Their goal is by 2023 is to deliver an infrastructure capable of running a human brain simulation. Uh, so slowly, one experiment at a time, they're finding things to piece together this titanic puzzle. The goal of the Human Brain Project is to achieve a simulation of the brain that uses detailed neurons, realistic in their structure and their behavior. Even with this ambitious goal and over €1 billion of funding from the European Union, the human brain is still totally out of reach. The current goal is to build a simulation of a rat brain, and we are only at the beginning of our endeavor to map and simulate a full human brain, but there's no theoretical reason why we can't get there. But here's a key question: would a working simulation of the brain be conscious? If the details were captured and simulated correctly, would we be looking at a sentient being? Would it think and be self-aware? So,
Yeah, that's the question that you ultimately have to answer. And there's an ethics question here as well, because we don't know the answer to that.
mhm.
If, for example, it did result in a sentient being, what are the ethical implications of that experiment now? Or, you know what I mean? So
Right.
there's a lot of things that come together here. This is where philosophy meets science and morality, excuse me, and all of
Yeah.
that. There's this quote from a movie. It's an '80s movie called Daryl, about a boy who is really a cyborg, that has a computer for a brain. But one of the quotes in the movie, and I use it all the time whenever I talk about AI or artificial intelligence emerging from whatever we're doing now. The quote is, "A machine becomes human when its creator can no longer tell the difference anymore." You know. So certainly from that perspective, we would have an ethical responsibility to treat this new being, if it is a being, with at least some level of rights, wouldn't we? Especially
Yeah.
if you don't know, if you can't answer the question of whether this is a conscious sentient being or not after seeing that it appears to be identical, wouldn't you have the ethical responsibility of treating it as such until proven otherwise?
Yeah, this goes back to the Turing test, right? Not being able to tell the difference, right? Yeah, I don't think it's just a matter of, the human species. I think anything that is self-aware and that you know, can has the desire to persist in its being, that can reason, maybe that has some type of feelings or empathy or whatever. Yeah, you don't exclude them because they're not human if other creatures exist. I mean, and even animals that are, not as advanced, in the cognitive way as us, they still, they're social animals like, other primates that, they're empathetic, they're social creatures also, and they feel pain and they all of that. So
Do you remember, you said you
um
were a Star Trek fan
yeah,
earlier. Did you watch The Next Generation?
I've got all of Star Trek on Blu-ray or DVD, man. I've seen it all.
Do you remember the episode? I think it's called The Measure of a Man. It's where Data is put on trial to determine whether or not he's a sentient being or not.
Yeah, that's a classic. I've got people that did not care to think about Star Trek into it by watching that episode. So yeah.
Yeah, it's great, and it really does address a lot of these issues.
Yeah, but this quote at the bottom by Brian Greene is speaking to just how much we know that the mind is the product of the brain. So he says when researchers can use functional magnetic resonance imaging to meticulously track blood flow supporting neural activity, or insert deep brain probes to detect electrical impulses firing along individual neurons, or use I don't know how to pronounce that, electrocephalograms to monitor electromagnetic waves
Electroencephalogram.
rippling across the brain. And when, yeah, electrocephalogram to monitor electromagnetic waves rippling across the brain. And when the data reveal clear patterns that mirror both observed behavior and reports of inner experience, the case for approaching consciousness as a physical phenomenon strengthens substantially. So,
Yeah, so an electroencephalographic profile is basically when they hook your brain up to that. You know what an EKG is, right? The heart
yeah,
monitor. It's
right.
basically the same thing except with your brain waves.
Okay. This is just about how we kind of can go beyond evolution and entropy. At least pockets. We get pockets of, order, entropy. But at the moment, we don't know the limits, or if there are limits to the kinds of data that the brain can incorporate. But it's clear that we are no longer a natural species that has to wait for sensory adaptations on an evolutionary timescale. As we move into the future, we will increasingly design our own sensory portals on the world. We'll wire ourselves into an expanded sensory reality. And I didn't include it, but in this book also, it shows how like deaf and blind people are able to see and hear through like devices. Like I think there was one of them that's like a I forget, some kind of vest like that you put on and you can like hear sound or something as vibration in a way. Uh,
So
but
that would
anyway,
probably be operating similar to the way that a lot of your snakes do, snakes that are deaf, and they sense the world through vibrations in their body,
yeah,
which would give deaf and blind people kind of a leg up on the soul, right? Because now they
yeah,
have an apparatus by which they can interpret data from the outside world, whereas the soul doesn't seem to have that without the body.
Yeah, and then evolution is instrumental in building structure. Entropy tends to degrade it, but they need not pull in opposite directions. A proper exegesis of the second law of thermodynamics renders an intelligent designer unnecessary. Regions containing concentrated energy and order are a natural consequence of the universe becoming ever more disordered. The entropic two-step allows structure to flourish here so long as entropy is expelled there. The dependence of reproductive success on genetic makeup is the reason Darwinian selection has long steered the evolutionary ship. A consequential difference of recent times is the invention of modern medicine and the protections provided by civilization more generally. So, obviously, natural selection is not working on us the same way that it used to, because obviously we're not at the mercy anywhere at all, really, of the environment or whatnot, because we, have our technology and civilization and all of that.
Yeah, and that's just really to say that we hinder the evolutionary process with the use of medicines and vaccines and technology and all that in ways that we can adapt the world to us rather than having adapt to the world we find ourselves in. So we're still evolving, but we're evolving much less rapidly, and we have some sort of control over it. We're not evolving as much through natural selection as other species, or as we used to.
Right. There's no avoiding the truth etched into the wiring of our brains that we need each other. We're a social species. And that's the foundation of morality. I mean, I wrote a blog about, it took me forever to write it, but basically you can boil morality down to the fact that that it's like two sentences. I feel bad when I treat another poorly. This speaks to our innate empathy. And I might be treated poorly by another if I do treat them poorly. And that speaks to the fact that we are an interconnected and interdependent social species. And that's and we all, at the core of our nature, we want to, most of us want to survive and flourish. And any recipe for that does not consider the bedrock facts of empathy and interconnectedness is going to be defective. And that's kind of the best foundation, and I think it's a solid foundation for morality. I mean, it's kind of an unavoidable, inevitable, basic fact about us and any species that might be like us. So it's not a property of the universe, but it's a foundational, key aspect of us. That
the universe doesn't care whether we live or die. It doesn't care how we treat each other. There's none of that. But I am glad that you added the caveat, most of us, because it's not always applicable, right? There are some people who don't have the capacity for empathy.
Right.
And when we look at sociopaths and all of that, but generally speaking.
But those exceptions prove the rule, and those people, but those exceptions prove the rule, and those people, they still have to consider the second part of that they're not an island. Nobody's completely autonomous, and they're going to be affected by the way they affect others. So
right, and if they don't consider that, what generally happens to them?
Yeah, they risk being in jail or who knows what, right?
Or taken out, right? They generally they don't survive to pass on that affliction, so to speak, to the next generation.
Exactly. Yep. No. So speaking on the future, pertaining to the brain, we don't know of a theoretical limit on what signals the brain could learn to incorporate. It might be possible to have almost any sort of physical locale basis, the kind of interaction with the world that we want. There's no reason an extension of you couldn't be taking care of tasks on the other side of the planet or mining rocks on the moon while you're enjoying a sandwich here on Earth. The body we arrive with is really just a starting point for humanity. In the distant future, we won't just be extending our physical bodies, but fundamentally our sense of self. As we take on new sensory experiences and control new kinds of bodies, that will change us profoundly as individuals. Our physicality sets the stage for how we feel, how we think, and who we are. Without the limitations of the standard issue senses and the standard issue body, we'll become different people. Our grandchildren may struggle to understand who we were and what was important to us. At this moment in history, we may have more in common with our Stone Age ancestors than our near future descendants. Yeah, I mean, this guy is a neuroscientist. I mean, he's an expert. So, and I've heard the similar things from other experts. So I'm not gonna, argue with them. I mean, who knows what we, how we can evolve technologically to overcome, as you were referring to, the natural selection that that we encounter in nature. I mean, what do you think about that? Like how far we could go?
I mean, well, it's obviously an optimistic view, but I don't see anything. I don't have any problems with this. Difficult to say whether we're closer now to our Stone Age ancestors than our near future descendants. A lot of that is relative talk, but no, I could certainly see us advancing. Look, it depends on if we survive this little experiment that we've got going on now. This 21st century experiment where we still have nuclear weapons. If we are to advance, we do have to avoid mutually assured destruction. We have to avoid the destruction of the planet. We have to preserve our resources. Climate change. There's no guarantees. Extinction events happen all the time in Earth history. So we still have to make it, but sure, assuming we can survive all of those things, there's nothing to stop us from there's no limits really, as far as I can see.
Yeah, one thing I like to point out though regarding like nuclear weapons is, a meteor could have always, and it did, it wiped out the dinosaurs, these potentially earth-ending or life-ending, events. But we did create nuclear weapons, but at least now we have the possibility, the means to avert, potential, destruction level events like that could have always happened. So,
are you suggesting our ability to use nuclear weapons to prevent like meteor strikes? Is that where you're going with that?
Yeah, I mean, so like, we can think about things and we can come up with strategies. I don't know what they might necessarily might be, but we at least have the opportunity to think things through. And I mean, I don't know how we would stop a meteor. I don't know all the details, and I'm sure some people have come up with different methods.
They've been making science fiction movies about this for decades.
Right, yeah. I don't want to get into citing some movie,
There's no shortage of ideas. How viable they are, we don't know. Right. But I guess the point that I was making is, while yes, we do have technology now to where we can solve a lot of the world's problems, it doesn't necessarily mean we're motivated to do that. At least we're not lockstep in solving problems. There's people who don't believe in climate change, for example, and they're not doing anything about it. We have nuclear weapons that could potentially defend us from Iraq, but and when I say Iraq, I mean Iraq in space, not the country of Iraq. But we also have nuclear weapons that could end all life on Earth at the same time. So it's a question of what do we do with them? Do we use them smartly? This sort of thing.
Yeah. So uploading and human potential, uploading may not be all that different from what happens to you each night when you go to sleep. You experience a little death of your consciousness every time you go to sleep, and the person who wakes up on your pillow the next morning inherits all your memories and believes him or herself to be you. Yeah, also the Star Trek thing, the beaming up the transporter. Yeah. So the way I understand it, theoretically, is you're going to be destroying yourself and then making a copy of it in the place you transport to. That's scary as hell. But could there be a way that you can just transport your atoms and your like you upload your your mind? Can you just transport all of the atoms and molecules in your body instead of them being destroyed? I don't know.
I would say no, due to what's known as the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, and really the inability to know certain states at that level. Star Trek gets around this because they have something called Heisenberg compensators that's attached to the transporter, right? But that's obviously not a real thing. It's a science fiction idea. Really, the reason that was invented is because of this idea that if you use a device that basically disintegrates you into pure energy and then recreates the same form of energy you've literally just killed a person and created a new one that's just like it. And so does that transfer the experience of qualia over to the new person, or does the new person just think that they're the old person, but really the old person is dead, And so that's
Right.
always one of the philosophical questions of Star Trek. But, when you brought this up, I wanted to go back to that question. Where does a soul go when it's unconscious, or when it's passed out or under general anesthesia? Where is your soul when you're sleeping? Is a soul sleeping too? And if it's true, if that's what people want to say, yeah, your soul is just sleeping. Well, why would a soul need to sleep if it's immaterial?
Right.
If you're not experiencing feeling and sensation and emotion and the ability to think, if you are unconscious, there is no soul. Your soul is gone. You're dead until it's revived in some way, because there's no experience there. And this is one of the reasons why I don't think that the idea of a soul that survives the death of the body makes sense either, because it certainly doesn't survive the sleeping of the body. It's just, it seems to go away, and then it doesn't seem to come back until you wake up. And so if your body dies, where is it then?
Right. And by the way, to give Star Trek credit, I mean, they always have science advisors and try to base things on real science, and they've actually inspired a lot of technology and people to become scientists and stuff.
Oh,
anyway,
absolutely. Including U.S. military. I used to be in the military as well, but a lot of concepts in the military have been inspired by Star Trek, both technological and just in terms of interaction and rank structure and how to lead and all of that. A lot of people in the military, the Navy in particular, but also the Air Force, are Star Trek fans traditionally.
Yeah, the variety of fields that people have gone into based on Star Trek is pretty cool, pretty astounding, really.
Yeah,
Everything from
massive,
philosophers to astronauts.
Right. You look at the first space shuttle was called the Enterprise.
Right. Yeah.
And it's obviously named after the Starship Enterprise, but in the Star Trek universe, the first space vehicle, re-entry vehicle is the Enterprise after the space shuttle. And so there's kind of a cycle there, true science fiction inspiring reality, inspiring science fiction.
Yeah. And speaking of Enterprise, I've been rewatching the show Enterprise that came out, about 20 years ago. It should have lasted longer because it kept getting a lot better and better.
Yeah.
And it's really, really, really good. A lot of it's really good, better than I remember. And but there's one season that's called the Xindi arc, where the Xindi attacked Earth or whatever, and it's an allegory for 9/11. But the Xindi were like, and I didn't get this when I first saw it for some reason, but it's a really cool idea that the Xindi are a bunch of species from the same planet that are different species, like insects, reptiles, primates, aquatic animals, and they all evolved intelligence on the same planet.
Right.
I mean, that's a pretty cool idea. If you can imagine how that would be, on Earth, if all of those different types of species involve similar levels of intelligence. Forget just other hominids, right? If they were still around, like Homo erectus or Neanderthals or whatever. If all these vast variety of species could involve that level of intelligence, that would be crazy. I mean,
it would, and it would really be extraordinary as well, because when you look at the history of humanity and all of the wars that we've had against other humans, can you imagine the type of destruction that would have resulted if we had multiple competing species of different needs and different ways of perceiving the world? Would we have survived each other?
Yeah, but science may give us the tools to transcend the evolutionary story. We can now hack our own hardware, and as a result, our brains don't need to remain as we've inherited them. We're capable of inhabiting new kinds of sensory realities and new kinds of bodies. Eventually, we may even be able to shed our physical forms altogether. I'm skeptical, but I don't know. Our species is just now discovering the tools to shape its own destiny. Who we become is up to us. And by the way, I'm perfectly fine with saying I don't know if there's life after death, but to all evidence, like we talked about the soul, I don't see it. The evidence is against it. But I'm always willing to say, I don't know things for sure. I don't know really what we can know with 100% certainty. I mean, pretty much all our knowledge and the way science works is probabilistic, right? And it's incrementally improving your knowledge. So yeah.
Yeah, I don't claim absolute knowledge on a lot of these metaphysical ideas at all, one way or the other. But what I can say is that I am convinced. I not only have no reason to believe in a life after death, but I have good reasons to disbelieve it.
Right.
So I believe there is no such thing as a life after death. I don't know that, but
right.
I'm rationally justified in believing that based on the evidence, based on experience, you know. But go on, I'll let you finish up.
Oh yeah, just to close up here, I just collected some quotes from Sam Harris's book Waking Up. Just some nice quotes about the mind and conscious experience, and it turned out pretty small, so I don't know if I can even read it, and it's kind of obscured with my little logo too, so I'll try to read it. So our minds are all we have, they've all we've ever had, and they are all we can offer others. Every experience you've ever had has been shaped by your mind. If you were perpetually angry, depressed, confused, and unloving, or your attention is elsewhere, it won't matter how successful you become or who you have in your life, you won't enjoy any of it. As a matter of conscious experience, the reality of your life is always now. I think this is a liberating truth about the nature of the human mind. In fact, I think that there's probably nothing more important to understand about your mind than that if you want to be happy in this world. The past is a memory, a thought arising in the present. The future is merely anticipated. It is another thought arising now. What we truly have is this moment. We spend most of our lives forgetting this truth, repudiating it, fleeing it, overlooking it. And the horror is that we succeed. We manage to never fully connect with the present moment and find fulfillment there because we are continually hoping to become happy in the future, and the future never arrives. Even when we think we're in the present moment, we're in very subtle ways always looking over its shoulder, anticipating what's coming next. We are always solving a problem, and it's always possible to simply drop your problem, if only for a moment, and enjoy what is true of your life in the present. And if you want to, jump in and comment on anything here, that's fine.
No, I mean it's really kind of poetic, more, but
Yeah.
a lot of it. And on the one hand, it seems like common sense to me, and then on the other hand, I can totally understand how a lot of people just don't perceive it in this way.
It's kind of common sense, but it's a kind of common sense that I think eludes us, and even those who are aware of it, it's something because the nature of our lives can be so hectic. We don't stop to reflect, right? Yeah.
We forget this. I was just telling a friend of mine online who was expressing some regret over some decision he had made. I think his comment was, my life would be totally different now if I had made a different decision or something, and then I replied, yeah, your life would be totally different. You could have died tragically as a 7-year-old in your rich family's $2 million swimming pool, or have been paralyzed at 15 on the way to your junior prom or whatever. Maybe, so we tend to always look at the best possible.
Yeah, and Harris makes the point. Yeah, and Harris makes the point that look at the way your life is now, and then imagine all the people who are in a position in their life much horrible than yours. Whatever your state that you're, unfavorable state you might be in, and also think about all the potential ways it could be much worse, right? And think about how, imagine you being in one of those situations yourself or someone else, and in those situations, you would be thinking, if only it would be like an answered prayer, if I could only just have the problem that you actually have right now, right? So
yeah. But yeah, we tend to see things when we're looking at our lives and judging it. We tend to have this romanticized or perfect world view of our alternative life timeline, but we never look at it in the negative sense about or consider the possibilities of what bad could have happened,
and when we think about the
in that way.
Yeah, and when we think about the indifferent nature, of the universe that we inhabit, there's a lot of luck. I mean, and you should really appreciate, what you have. Keep striving, but also stand back and absorb what you and appreciate what you have and what you have accomplished, right?
Yeah.
So it can be liberating to see how thought pulls the lever of emotion, how negative emotions in turn set the stage for patterns of thinking that keep them active and coloring one's mind. Seeing this process clearly can mean the difference between being angry, depressed, or fearful for a few moments and being so for days or weeks. Such transitions from happiness to suffering are fascinating. Merely witnessing them goes a long way towards restoring equanimity. My mind begins to seem like a video game. I can either play it intelligently, learning more in each round, or I can be killed in the same spot by the same monster again and again. Confusion and suffering may be our birthright, but wisdom and happiness are available. The landscape of human experience allows deeply transformative insights, but these states must be understood in terms of neuroscience, psychology, and related fields. Nothing, nothing need replace ludicrous and divisive doctrines such as that Jesus will return to earth and throw unbelievers in a fire, or that death in defense of Islam is the highest good. These are terrifying and debasing fictions. Beyond ensuring our survival, civilization is actually a vast machine invented by the human mind to regulate its states. We are ever in the process of repairing and creating a world that our minds want to be in.
Yeah, a little judgment in that second to the last sentence, but I understand what he was getting at.
Which part are you referring to?
There's some judgmental language there in the sense of ludicrous ideas or fictions. Whether or not it's ludicrous is somewhat subjective, and whether or not it's a fiction is a belief, right? So
okay, well, if we're thinking logically and we're thinking based on evidence, then could you not objectively call that ludicrous? I mean,
yes, you could, but I guess what I'm saying is, couching it in that way is a bit of, doesn't do anything to endear someone who is coming from that position to see your point.
I think he's trying to emphasize the point that what I'm saying is not like woo-woo, and it's not religious or any of this other stuff, right? It's and it's based in neuroscience and facts and just observations about our conscious experience. Yeah.
Right. I get that, which is why I said I understand what he's getting at. I don't know if that's the best means of communicating that to someone who's not already on board, but that's a different issue. Yeah.
So we lurch between wanting and not wanting, lost in the movie of our lives. The change comes when we experience the present moment prior to the arising of thought. Just recognizing the impermanence of our mental states can transform your life. Every mental state you've ever had has arisen and then passed away. It is possible to love your neighbor as oneself, and it lends absolutely no credence to any religion or pseudoscience. What we need to become happier and make the world a better place is not more pious illusions, but a clear understanding of the way things really are. And some people say, well, why do you care about truth? Why do you want to know what's true? Why does it matter to you? Well, number one, just because I do, because by our nature as human beings, we're curious and we want to know things, right? But the second part of that,
asking one question.
Theists say it,
Really?
then just like they talk about purpose, like if the universe itself doesn't have a purpose, how can you have a purpose? It's completely, absurd. But the other thing about truth is our leverage on the future. We want to have accurate information in order to have effective and desirable outcomes and solutions, right? That's the other part of it.
The statement about truth is very simple. Why do I want to know what is true? Because I don't. And that's all the justification you need. And this is really everyone's stance. I think maybe the difference between religious people and non-religious people is that non-religious people like me can acknowledge that I don't have the truth. Whereas if I was religious, I would be claiming that I did, even though I really don't, I would rather just tell the truth and be honest. I don't actually have the truth. And that's what frees you up to look for it. If you pretend that you already have it, then you're no longer necessarily motivated to find it. And that's where it becomes problematic.
No doubt certain people can derive mental pleasure from harming others, but we know these states are anomalous and not sustainable because we depend on one another for almost everything. Given our social requirements, we know that the deepest forms of well-being must be compatible with an ethical concern for others. Otherwise, violent conflict becomes inevitable. We also know that certain forms of happiness are not available to a person if he, like Genghis Khan, finds himself on the winning side of every siege. Some pleasures are intrinsically ethical, like love, gratitude, devotion, and compassion. A capacity to be free in this moment in the midst of whatever else is happening, you will have already solved most of the problems you will encounter in life. And I don't, going back to free will, talking about being free, even though you didn't freely will your freedom, you can still get there, and try to get there, even though you're not willing to trying, or it gets complicated. Yeah, the human mind is the most complex and subtle expression of reality we have thus far encountered. This should grant profundity to the humble project of noticing what it's like to be you in the present. To seek to live a spiritual life without deluding ourselves, we must view these experiences in universal and secular terms. And then this is the last slide here. Just talking about, I've never come across a notion of good or bad, desirable, undesirable, that does not depend on some change in the experience of conscious creatures. We have ethical obligations to others to the degree that we can alter their conscious experience, like we don't have obligations to rocks. We now know that, at least you were talking about this, two systems in the brain called the dual process govern human cognition, emotion, and behavior. One evolutionarily older, unconscious, and automatic. The other evolved more recently and is more conscious and deliberative. When you find another person annoying, sexually attractive, or inadvertently funny, you are experiencing the percolations of System 1. The heroic efforts you make to conceal these feelings out of politeness are the workings of System 2.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the last quote, it is possible to be happy before anything happens, before one's desires are gratified, and there is an alternative to being continuously spellbound by the conversation that we have with ourselves. So yeah.
Yeah, and I noticed you getting tripped up a little bit a few minutes ago when you were trying to reconcile the idea of free will and the fact that we don't have it. And the answer to that is we don't have free will. Free will doesn't exist, but we do have the illusion of free will, and we're all trapped.
Well, Harris says we don't even have the illusion if we pay attention, because things just emerge and we don't really. Yeah.
Well, it may depend on to the extent at which you pay attention, but most people are trapped in that illusion. They perceive free will as this existing thing. And I think because of that, that's really all that you need to motivate yourself, to do things to improve your way of life. You don't just give up and say, well, it's not up to me. I have no choice. It's already determined by causes external to me, so I just give up. No, it seems like I can do something about this, so I'm going to do what I can do, even if it's ultimately, even if it's determined by causes that were outside of me. I'm still motivated to do it because it seems like I have free will, and that's really all that you need. Yeah.
Well, I guess we'll end it there. I mean, it's been a really fun and deep dive into the brain and everything related to it. Thanks so much for being on. And if anybody that watches this wants to look you up, if you want to let them know where they can find you.
Well, you can find me I don't have links available, but I go by Bryce Aroni on Facebook, and also I'm on the EA show every Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern. And the EA show is short for Empathetic Atheists, where we take call-in. We don't take call-ins, but we have a pre-scheduled arrangement of theists and atheists and people coming from different perspectives. And then we do an after show after that, where people who are watching can come on the show and discuss what was watched. So
you guys did a show about the soul pretty recently, right?
We did, and we talk about it every now and then. It's a really interesting conversation, and I never really get to ask all the questions or inject all of the ideas about it that I would, because we always seem to kind of run out of time, but I could talk about the soul all day long and never get to the end of it. One question I always want to ask that I never really get to, and this is really directed to the people who believe in the soul: when does ensoulment happen? When do we get our soul?
At what point in the evolutionary process did our species or a species get a soul, right? Yeah.
Yeah, or even well, I don't ask that question because a lot of these people don't believe in an evolutionary process, you know. So,
The
but
animals
that's
have a
fine.
soul. They suffer.
If
What
you,
what was their original sin? Yeah.
yeah, but if you believe that you have a soul, when did you get it? You know,
Right.
did you get it at conception? Was it at pregnancy? Was it at birth? When you were 7 years old? Like, when did you actually get your soul? You know, because
Yeah.
any answer is problematic. If you got your soul at conception, then now you have to have an explanation for what happened to all of the souls that were killed when a woman has her period. You know, a lot of those are conceived eggs that don't make it to pregnancy. You know,
Right.
if it
Yeah.
happened at pregnancy, then what happens when the egg splits into identical twins? Where do we get the additional soul from?
Or
You know,
combines to become a
or
chimera.
combine, right?
Yeah. There's
Yeah.
so many things with abortion. I mean, that make it so nebulous, the process, and it's
Mhm.
so complicated and unique of a situation. I don't think you can compare it to simplistic other
What I really
examples. I
want to
don't.
know, I tell you, what I really want to know is whether a person with dissociative identity disorder has one soul or multiple souls, and that's a tricky
Yeah,
one
I
for
haven't thought about that. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah,
you know. But yeah,
yeah,
there's a lot of questions associated with that that we just will never have time to get through in one show. But just some thoughts about it.
yeah. Well, yeah. Again,
But
it's been
thanks for
fun.
having me.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much for being on. Um,
Yeah.